Hello, everyone. This is the Overcoming Resistance podcast, and I'm your host, Louis Carell. Today, I'm going to be doing a solo Q&A episode based on some questions I've received from friends in the gym, as well as from some viewers. Thank you, as always, for listening, and enjoy the show. So today, the first question that we received was about warming up. So the question was generally, there's a lot of conflicting information about what is a good warm up, especially when it comes for, lifting weights, more so for like building muscle. Because you go online and you're going to see a lot of different people talking about different warm ups. Some of them are a little more extensive, like a long dynamic warm up or involving like foam rolling or stretching. And then other people will say, like, you don't really need to worry about any of that. You just need to, if you're going to squat for the day, it's your first movement, just go in, get under the squat bar and start doing some reps with the unloaded bar, and then slowly add load and then work up to your working weight. What is right? Where is the middle ground here? Because, that's the difference between what a 30-minute warm up before you even touch the bar and just going in and starting, basically. So it might be useful to think about, well, what is the point of a warm up? Well, it's in the name. It's really to get the body warm, get your heart rate up a little bit, get the muscles warm, get your body temperature up. Because the muscles, they stretch better. They're a little more elastic. Same with your tendons when you're at a higher temperature, when you're warm. And so this is really, in a way, partially for preventing injury. Because if your muscle's very tight, it's cold, not very elastic, and you put a bunch of weight on there, it may not be ready to handle that dynamic contraction of, say, like a full depth squat with a lot of load. Body weight, sure, but if you're going to put 200 pounds on there, those tissues might not be ready without a little preparation. The second is performance. Those tissues, even if they can handle that 200-pound squat, for example, and you're not going to get hurt, is your nervous system going to be ready to handle that 200 pounds from no loading, for example? Or, are those tissues going to be as elastic and responsive for that weight? So your performance may not be as good. So there's a couple things that the warm-up's really designed to do. And when it comes to like lifting weights to like build muscle, generally speaking, if you're a healthy person, you don't have any injury history, limitations, let's say your first movement's to squat and you go in, get under a squat bar, get into your squat stance, grab the bar, set up everything, and everything feels great with just doing 10 to 20 reps with the bar. There's probably not a lot of other warm up you need to do, right? Because you're going to slowly add weight to the bar. So let's say your top set's 200 pounds for a mathematical example. You're going to do 10 reps at 200 pounds. That's your planned starting weight and reps. And so, you're going to start with the bar. Maybe you do 95 pounds. Maybe you go 135, 155, 175, and then maybe 200. So that whole process of putting weight on the bar, doing some reps and slowly working up, that is the warm up. That is a warm up, getting your body warm for the lift. And then you do your top sets, and then generally speaking, your body's going to be pretty warm at that point. And then you go on to do maybe other leg movements, and so you're warm globally and ready for that whole workout. So you don't really need to do an extensive warm up. So like, when would all that other stuff become more applicable? So let's say you're a smaller person and you find that maybe you don't lift a lot of weight. Say you're going to squat and your top set's 100 pounds. Well, the bar is 45, so you're already almost 50% there just with the bar. And let's say you do, 45 pounds just the bar, then 65, 85, then 100, but you're not all that warm and you're a smaller person, so you don't really generate as much body heat because you're not as big. You don't have as high of a metabolism because you're smaller. So maybe getting on the treadmill for 5 to 10 minutes before touching the weight can be a good way to help globally warm up your body. So that is an option. So now we've added something besides just doing the movement itself, but that's on a needs analysis based on the person. If you're 200 pounds and you're squatting, and by the time you get to your top set of 300 pounds, you're already sweating. And again, you get under the bar and everything feels good. You don't have any limitations, injury. Do you need to then get on the treadmill? Well, probably not. Right. So we're kind of dissecting these two differences of when would something like maybe a little bit of treadmill work or getting on a cardio machine be useful as a part of a warm up. Well, if it's going to help you globally warm up. The other thing you could do too is if you're a smaller person, you're not as strong, meaning you don't have as many warm up sets working up to your top weight, you can repeat warm up sets if you would prefer that. Like maybe you're like, I'd rather just squat. Well, okay, so maybe instead of just doing, your top set's 100 pounds on the squat, maybe instead of just doing 45 pounds, just the bar, 65 pounds, 85 pounds, and then 100, maybe you do 45 pounds for 2 sets, 65 pounds for 2 sets, 85 pounds for 1 set, and then 100 pounds for your top set. And so now you've effectively added like 2 or 3 extra sets within your warm up, and that's viable too. So again, generally speaking, for building muscle, if you're healthy and you don't have any limitations, just starting with the main movement of the day kind of is starting off the warm-up process. Maybe a little cardio if you're lighter or you find it helps you globally warm up. Maybe your gym is really cold and has good AC. Just getting your core temperature up a little bit, 5-10 minutes, that's also good. So then, now you hear about all these other ones where people are doing like dynamic stretches where they're, doing like leg swings and all these unique things, putting their muscles through a stretch position, but then it's like very quick. So they're not static stretching, which is where you would stretch and hold a position for an extended period. They're moving in and out of stretch positions. And so that's usually talked about being good for a warm up. You'll hear people say, you don't really want a static stretch for a warm up. And the reason for that is that there is some research showing that static stretching prior to like lifting weights can potentially decrease performance in the short term. So what am I saying? So if you were to stretch your pecs and then immediately go bench press, your bench press performance might be a little bit lower. And the reason for that is you're basically taking away some of the sensitivity of the stretch reflex of the pecs when you statically stretch. And part of what allows you to have your best performance is a good stretch reflex with a lot of movements, but the stretch reflex is where the lowering phase of the lift, we call that the eccentric. The body's basically like almost like you think about the muscles like a rubber band as a simple analogy. And so they're stretching and then they're absorbing energy. And then the contraction, the concentric phase is the rubber band coming back together. If you overstretch a rubber band, it doesn't have as much spring, right? So that's kind of like what static stretching can do in the short term. But the research isn't entirely super clear. I mean, generally speaking, like what are we talking about? Well, that would be like stretching your pecs for like 60 seconds per pec and then immediately going and trying to bench press like a top set. That's probably not ideal for performance. Now, if you were to stretch your pecs for 30, 40 seconds and then go warm up the bench press, a lot of that performance decrease is probably gone by the time you get to your top set. So it wouldn't be as much of a worry, but like, where's the benefit though? Even if you were to do like dynamic arm swings, stretching the pecs for the bench press versus a static stretch, like, I previously said, if you're healthy, just maybe start with the bench press itself. If you can bench press full range, healthy, no problems, then just bench press, unless you need to, of course, get your body temperature up, then maybe get on the treadmill a little bit. So when would all these other things be good? I think a lot of the more elongated warm-ups are great, especially for athletes, because if you're lifting weights, we don't really have a lot of demands. We're not doing a whole lot. It's very movement specific. You're very controlled. Even for the less controlled movements, like a bench press versus machine chest press, it's still pretty controlled. They're not a field athlete where you're having to move in multiple directions and a lot of shear forces going through different tissues. And there's a lot of demands and quick power movements going through the body. Dynamic warm-ups are a little more applicable to those people. If you're that type of person, then yeah, maybe that information is more applicable to you. But if we're just talking building muscle, lifting weights, not so much. Now, maybe you enjoy it. Maybe it makes you feel good. I think it's a valid reason to do it. But, some of those longer warm-ups, they can be 15, 20, 30 minutes long. It's a little bit of a preference thing. When I get to the gym, I'm ready to go. I want to lift. So I don't want to have a 20-minute warm up or higher to touching the bar, because that might make me lose a little bit of that umph that I have getting in. However, sometimes if you get in the gym and you're pretty drained, maybe doing a 15-minute extra long warm up kind of give you a little time to get those gears going, get into that groove. So now it's not a set in stone. You're going to do a 15, 20-minute dynamic athlete-based warm up every workout. Maybe you'll do it if you just need a little extra time between the time you walk in the door and the time you actually really start lifting to kind of get in the mindset. Outside of that, I think if you have an injury history or you have the inability to do your first movement effectively straight out the gate, then some of these longer warm-ups can be good, and they should be done on a needs analysis basis. So I, for example, have two separated AC joints. So my shoulders chronically have a little bit of wear and tear to them. If I do about 5 minutes of some drills that are specific to me prior to any upper body based workouts, it generally keeps my shoulders pretty healthy, keeps them a little bit loose, gets them ready for the movement. Generally speaking, the movement I'm going to do first, let's say if it's a bench press, isn't quite enough most of the time. So I need to do at least like 5 minutes of something prior to touching a bar and then like pressing. But that's specific to me. If you don't have that issue, then you don't need to do it. Or let's say you go to squat and you can't quite squat to depth and your hips are a little tight. Maybe doing a little bit prior to actually squatting the bar gets those hips just opened up enough to where you can do the movement through a full range, no pain, do it effectively. And that should be the goal. You want to be able to do your first movement or whatever movement you're doing before you do it through a full range without pain effectively. And so, this comes up a little bit less with people that are trying to build muscle. And the reason for that is generally you have a lot of movement variety. And so some of the stuff that people deal with, especially like powerlifters, when they're warming up is movement specific, meaning, if you're squatting 3 days a week, maybe your hips are getting a little more tight as a reaction to squatting 3 days a week. You're putting a lot of force, a lot of pressure through a specific movement, through a specific pattern, through those tissues. Now, if you were to only squat once a week and, maybe do legs 3 times a week, but you're doing leg press and other movements, lunges, you're not getting that same specific loading and wear through those tissues. So you might not need to do all that much of a warm up. So if you're trying to build muscle, this is usually not that common. A lot of people can just go in and just start lifting. But maybe you find as a power lifter, because you are squatting 3 days a week, you need to do a little bit more specific 5-10 minutes of hip work or something to get your hips ready for the loading of the squat. And that's actually more like you're doing a warm up as a reactive response to the chronic loading. Is that bad? No, not necessarily. You're in a sport that requires, 3 specific movements. You're going to be slightly imbalanced and your body's going to react to that imbalance. But what makes you a good powerlifter is the fact that you are slightly imbalanced. You're leaning towards being good at squat, bench press, and deadlift. Your body will respond to that a little bit, and thus, you're basically mitigating some of that. Because if you don't do something for those hips, for example, in this example, and they're a little tight and you're not quite squatting to depth, and then you keep pushing it, maybe you do start causing a little more tissue wear and tear, a little more damage, a little more overuse by not addressing it in the warm-up. So you actually are kind of creating a slight overuse injury pattern. And that's specific to my example of the powerlifting because you're doing the same movement. But if you were to do barbell squat day 1, that's Monday, for example, and then you're doing hack squat day 2, and that's Wednesday, and then maybe you do walking lunges day 3, and that's Friday. Those might be different enough that you don't ever run into this as somebody just focusing on building muscle. So that kind of gives an overview of like warming up. So kind of to reiterate just again, what's the framework I'm really using? Again, we're talking about somebody whose primary goal, this question came from someone whose primary goal is to build muscle. They're not a powerlifter. They're not a field athlete. They're not having to do specific movements. So my advice to this type of person is do only what is necessary to get you to be able to do your first movement effectively. If it's just going in the gym, getting under the bar, that's it. Just go ahead and warm up. Go ahead and warm up under the bar and do what you're going to do for squatting, for example. If you find, well, no, I need a little bit more, okay, maybe get on the treadmill a couple minutes, get your body temperature up. And of course, if there's something specific for an injury or something you're working around or something you just notice that kind of always bothers you, maybe you have a sitting job all day and your hips feel tight from sitting. So you do a couple stretches, a couple drills, maybe foam roll just to open up that area before you squat. That's fine. But you kind of want to minimize that time. And again, the only reason I say that is because I do tend to find for a lot of people, they get into the gym, maybe they're a little tired or they're just wanting to get it going. Having a 20, 30-minute warm up can almost take the wind out of your sails a little bit before you even touch the bar. And especially if you work out in commercial gyms too. I mean, sometimes having a little bit of a warm up can be great while you're waiting for equipment. Great, get you in the mindset. And other days, I mean, honestly, if you have to do a 20-minute warm up and the squat rack's open, you got to squat. It's a busy commercial gym. Is that squat rack going to be open by the time you're done with your warm up? Who knows? Sometimes you just got to take advantage of that day and get in there and get on that equipment, or else now you've done a 20-minute warm up. You're ready to start your workout. You're really wanting to go because you wanted to start it when you walked in the door. Now you got to wait 20 minutes for somebody to finish. Now you're 40 minutes into being in the gym before you've actually ever done any of your workout past warming up. So I hope that helps the individual who asked the question. And then anyone else listening, just about some ideas of warming up. So when you see different content out there, just kind of think about, well, who's it targeted towards? Is it for athletes? Is it for powerlifters? Is it for somebody building muscle? Is this person focused on maybe those that have previous injuries? What is it, a cold climate? Is it hot? Where are some of these factors coming in? Who are they speaking to? And what's their bias? The next question that I got from someone was about stretching. So when it comes to stretching, the question was, do I need to stretch? Is it important to stretch after my workouts? And, again, they see confusing and conflicting information about some people saying, well, no, if you're lifting weights through a full range of motion, you don't ever need to stretch. And other people saying, no, you should definitely still do some stretching after your workouts. And again, this is going to be a little bit of it depends, of course. So lifting weights is essentially a weighted stretch to some degree. So I defined earlier what a dynamic warm-up kind of is and involves what are called dynamic stretches, which is where you are putting a muscle through its full range, you're stretching it, but you're doing it quickly. So, if you're to do a pec stretch against the wall, your hands on the wall and you're leaning away, you would do that quickly. You would not so quick that you might injure yourself, but you might put your hand on the wall, move into the stretch, and then get out of the stretch. You don't really hold it for like 30, 40 seconds. You're just kind of going in and out of that pattern. And that's a dynamic stretch. A static stretch, again, is where you would push yourself, in the example of the pec, away from the wall, and then you would hold that peak stretch position for like 30, 60 seconds. Lifting, in a way, is very similar to that. I mean, if you're doing a bench press, the pecs are going to be stretched and loaded at the bottom, which is basically a stretch with load, and then you contract on the way up, and in a way, it's like a loaded dynamic stretch. So lifting weights, in a way, does create a stretching and pattern, and your body will adapt to the demands you put on it. So if you are squatting through a full range of motion, pressing through full ranges, doing all your movements through full ranges, you're going to maintain, generally speaking, the ability to move your body through those ranges of motion because your body knows it has the demand to need to be able to do that with weight. So, you don't maybe see a lot of powerlifters doing a whole lot of stretching if they can do the power lifts, because they are in the sport of squat, bench, deadlift. If they can move heavy load through those full ranges, that in a way helps maintain that most of the time. They don't need to do more stretching beyond that in a lot of cases. That's a good example. So do you need to stretch? Well, this will come on a needs analysis. If there's something that you want mobility in some tissue, joint area that's not being addressed within your weightlifting resistance training workouts, then you probably should consider stretching that area. Or let's say you get a lot of overuse. I brought up an example during the warm-up of the squat and the hips. Well, I kind of contradicted myself a little bit, right? I said, if you're squatting and you're squatting with load and you can do it effectively, then that helps maintain the ability to do that. But I said, some people find if, say, they're squatting 3 days a week as a powerlifter, their hips will reactively become tighter just through some wear and tear. of kind of little overuse through the same pattern. So if you notice that, then yeah, maybe some post exercise stretching could be a good idea to kind of help get ahead of that, mitigate it for the next workout. So now you're stretching your hips in my example of the hips being tight after squatting. You're maybe doing a little bit of static stretching for the hips after each squat session, which then helps create a little bit of extra mobility in those tissues in preparation for the next squat workout, which then you have maybe have to warm up a little extra as well. So they kind of almost build off each other. So stretching can be viewed as kind of a protocol for cool down after a workout. Now, when would you want to stretch? Is it pre, post on a separate day? I usually wouldn't stretch pre-workout for the reason we talked about before. This may be potentially an acute performance decrease. What's the goal of the warm-up? If you need to stretch to get into the right position to do the movement in a healthy manner, then yes, you would want a static stretch or dynamic stretch prior to doing the movement. But as far as creating long-term tissue changes of mobility, stretching after your workouts is a great place to put it on the same day as a workout because your body temperature is already up from working out. So the muscles are more responsive and elastic. And you don't have to worry about performance decrease as well, potentially. You can do it on a day that's separate from your workout. On a rest day, you can static stretch those tissues. But really the static stretching, in my personal experience, is a great option for, again, helping kind of get ahead of a little bit of mitigation from overuse. Maybe you're doing certain patterns, or if you're lifting or what you're doing isn't really putting you in the position that you want to improve. If you want to increase your hamstring flexibility and you're doing a Romanian or stiff-legged deadlift, but the mobility isn't really being challenged because of the, when you're doing the movement, meaning, maybe you want to be able to lower the bar in a longer range, but because your hamstrings are tight now, you can only lower it with load comfortably to a certain point. Maybe you will statically stretch and do different things after your workouts for your hamstrings to increase that mobility over time. And that, could be an option. So I do like static stretching, especially for areas maybe like you got tight calves and you want them to be more mobile so you can get better squat patterns, or, you maybe have chronically tight shoulders from sitting, working a desk job and doing a lot of pressing, and it makes them feel a little bit better to be a little more loose. It's great for, in my opinion, unless you need it again to do the movement of the day that you're doing safely, I would save it for after your workouts when you're still warm. And then I would also consider it for off days. And, why would you stretch? Like, what's the benefit? Well, I talked about mitigation of maybe some overuse, maybe, for feeling good, maybe you have some injury history, or you're just noticing, oh, I have chronically tight shoulders. It feels better when I stretch them. There's some subjective aspect to that. There might be some objective use as well. I brought up the stiff-legged deadlift, Romanian deadlift example. Well, maybe your hamstrings can't grow as effectively because they're so tight. You can't challenge them through the same range. Or maybe it's not even the hamstring being a limitation because the hamstring is getting a full stretch based on how tight it is. Maybe it's the glutes not getting as much of a stretch because the hamstrings only stretch so far and the glutes aren't able to move through as far of a range themselves to maximize their stretch. So now you're increasing your hamstring mobility and flexibility over time. So that way now you can do a Romanian deadlift with a longer range, which then allows the hips to move back further, thus causing a better stretch in the glute muscles, thus now making the Romanian deadlift a very good movement for you for both the hamstrings and the glutes, when prior, based on your limitations, it was primarily a hamstring movement and it wasn't doing as much for your glutes. Now, what's the downside? So we really only need the mobility and flexibility we need to do the movements we're trying to do effectively. As someone whose maybe primary goal is building muscle or an athlete, you really don't need much more than that. Again, unless it's a personal goal. If you just have a personal goal, who am I to tell you you don't need that flexibility? But just remember that when I talked about with the warm-up, what is a muscle doing? It's kind of like a rubber band. You generally want enough flexibility to do whatever the movement you're trying to do and just a little bit more. You don't want your flexibility to be the maximum of the movement, because when do muscles get hurt? It's generally when the stretch reflex is pushed to its absolute limit, and then it doesn't have the range really to come back. You have a max load at a max range, and then all it takes is for that slight misfire, and you can sometimes get an injury. I'm being very broad with it. I'm not an injury specialist, but generally that's a general concept that comes up. So if you're going to bench press and the bottom of the bench press is the maximum your pecs can take, and then you put on all the load you can handle, you're at a very interesting position there. Maximum force going through that tissue at its maximum range. It just takes the misfire of that tissue, the Golgi tendon reflex, and that could be an injury. Now, if you had slightly more range than what's needed at the bottom of bench press, not much more, just slightly more, that means that now you're putting max load through a movement that isn't maximum range. And that gives you a little bit of room with that Golgi tendon reflex to have a little room where it's not pushed to its absolute brink. And so that could be another good reason for stretching, is just to kind of give you a little bit of that wiggle room, especially if you're an athlete, or you're really focused on performance as someone who likes to build muscle. So there's a little bit of injury prevention in that sense. Now, is stretching universally going to prevent injury? No, stretching for stretching's sake isn't really linked with preventing injury, but it might be movement specific if you find that you're pushing the very brink of your mobility with maximum loads. So now I hope that clears up some common misconceptions about stretching and kind of like how it can be useful and when. And the other thing too, the only other drawback I'll say is if you have now a 20-minute stretching routine that you're doing every day for no real rhyme or reason, there's no personal goal, it doesn't, it's not helping you feel better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all things we talked about. It's just like the warm-up, get into the gym, I'm ready to go. I don't want to do a 20-minute warm-up every time. Sometimes I just want to get under the bar. Same with the stretching, depending on if you need it and there's a goal attached, you're going to be more inclined to keep up with it. But you're done with your workout, you're ready to go home, you're ready to go eat. Now you got to do 20 minutes of stretching just for stretching's sake. Again, that kind of like, how compliant is somebody going to be with that? And is it just going to add to the overall? Because what are you lifting? Most people lift for an hour and a half, and now you have a 20-minute warm-up on the front end and a 20-minute cool down on the back end. Now it's 2 hours plus hours. And there's not a specific reason that you're doing it that's getting you to buy into keeping up with that. It can almost make the workout seem a little more daunting. You're like, oh, I am wanting to lift, but I'm not really excited for that 40 minutes of extra warming up and cooling down collectively. So that's something to think about too. You have to consider consistency and time. If you need to do the stretching and again, you're like, oh, I don't really want to do it today, you could do it later on in the day. It doesn't have to be right after you work out. Just post-workout's a great time because you're warm, be on your off days, in that case. So, there's they kind of go hand in hand, the warming up, stretching, because it's almost like a warm up for the sessions. And then the stretching can be part of like the cooling down process. And then really the last question I had gotten was kind of talking about injuries and injury prevention and coming back. And I'd already stated I'm not an injury specialist, but I've been hurt quite a few times. So I have some personal experience with this topic. And there's kind of two parts to it. First, there is kind of like thinking about what goes into leading to the scenario where injuries are most likely to happen. How do you come back from it? Which we'll talk broadly because it's generally more specific to the injury itself. And then there's like the mental side, right? So there's a couple different areas here. So, what are the things that they seem to see that are most linked with, being associated with an injury? Well, you have a couple of things. First is fatigue. So what is that? I've talked about it before on the podcast, but it's a collective term, just kind of, it could be the muscle damage from doing a lot of like lifting. It could be being tired from doing a lot of exercise or movement. It could be mental fatigue from maybe you're doing a lot of hard computer work early in the day. It could be you're really stressed out in life, you're not getting enough sleep. So it's a collective term kind of talking about all these stressors adding up. So there's a fatigue component. And why is there a fatigue component? Well, generally speaking, even if it's mental fatigue, central nervous system fatigue from previous workouts, or even more specific to the muscle itself, muscle damage related fatigue, that can cause your motor control, your ability to do your movement, to be slightly off. So, the muscle may not contract perfectly at the right time, or you might just be slightly out of position or out of the area that you need to do. And it's more of an issue, say, if you were to be like a powerlifter doing a 1 rep max squat, maybe something goes a little awry because your body's not quite primed for that 1 rep max on that day. That's an example. Or, it could just be the muscle not quite ready to handle that load. Any normal, healthy day, the muscle's ready to handle that load. But on that day, you just got some fatigue, the muscle misfired a little bit. Basically, an example would be, let's say I talked about before, the kind of that stretch reflex. Well, ideally, the muscle would be stretching as you're lowering the weight and then contracting as you're going up. But what if a muscle fiber is lengthening as you lower, and then it pre-fires while you're still lowering? Well, now it's trying to contract while the rest is stretching, and that can cause like a tearing, right? Because it's trying to contract, but the load's so high, it's going the other way. So, and that could just be due to the lack of motor control. So there's a fatigue component. There can be an overuse aspect. Let's say your tissues aren't recovering well from squatting 4 days a week, and you're squatting 4 days a week and putting a lot of force through them, and then they're just not quite healthy enough to handle that force the next time, and then something goes. So there can be a recovery component, there's a fatigue component, and then it's arguable, but there could potentially be a form component. Now, I'm not going to say that just because form isn't what we call textbook perfect, it's going to lead to an injury. The human body is very adaptable, and it can usually adapt to a lot of demands you put on it. But it'd be more of a concern if you don't train the body through that form often, and now you're putting a lot of load on there. So an example would be the deadlift. A lot of people deadlift with a relatively flat, straight back, and they'll do most of their reps and their loading through that pattern. And some people deadlift with a slightly rounded back, but then they do a lot of their reps and loading and constant work through that pattern. The body's adapted to for the person deadlifting with a flat back, straight back, their body's adapted to that. And the person deadlifting with a round back, their body's adapted to that. But what happens when the person with the straight back is doing a 10 rep maximum they can do for 10 reps, and their back rounds on rep 7, and the person keeps going? Well, that person doesn't train with a rounded back. Their tissues aren't ready for it. Is rounded back deadlifting inherently injurious? Well, not really, but their tissues aren't prepared for that. And thus, that might increase their injury risk, where they might notice, oh man, my back rounded. Now I got my back tweaked. Man, rounded back deadlifting leads to injury. Well, no, not necessarily. It's just you weren't prepared for that. Your body got out of position. Again, kind of almost like a fatigue, because you do a little loss of motor control, and your tissues weren't ready for that. So that's where technique and injury comes in a little bit, because it's not that a lot of techniques are going to immediately cause an injury. It's that the body's not prepared for that position, for that technique. Now, would I then say you should deadlift with your back as rounded as humanly possible? Well, probably not. There might be something there. There's enough people that get hurt with that position, even if they do it often enough, compared to a more flat back, a less rounded position, in the deadlift example. So there's a little bit of you maybe don't want to push a lot of load through that tissue just in general, but is some of that deviation injurious? No, not if the body's prepared for it. So that kind of predates a little bit well, what are we thinking about going into, an injury? So then how would you kind of mitigate a little bit of that? Well, we'll make sure you're recovering well between your workouts. If you notice you have a lot on your plate, you're pretty fatigued, maybe auto-regulate some of your loads, be considerate, maybe try not to be so stubborn that you're going to go for whatever your maximum is. If things are just feeling off, you're feeling tired and drained, maybe just kind of auto-regulate a little bit there. Try to get a good amount of sleep, eat well, get enough calories, protein, manage your outside stress when you can, try to keep up on all the other things that build into this process. Do a consistent technique, whatever that is, try to keep that consistent, because that means that's what your tissues are prepared to handle. If you notice you're going for a 10 rep max and on rep 7, you're really getting out of position, is it worth getting to the 10 reps today? Or is it better just to be like, hey, I've really gotten out of position. I'm just going to, on rep 8, okay, I'm going to call it. Live to fight another day. Maybe that 10 rep max would have been a PR, but what if you got hurt on rep 9? Was it worth it? Just remember what the long-term goals are in that case. Put the ego at the door a little bit. So, that's kind of what I would personally take on. Listen to your body, be aware of kind of what some of these factors that go into creating the environment for an injury. And then if you start to notice them coming up, it's maybe time to think about, is it worth going for it? If you're a powerlifter and you're noticing some of these things on meet day, but the meet is the goal, maybe you'll risk it a little bit more. Does it mean you're going to get hurt? No, this is not a guarantee at all that if these factors are present, you're going to get hurt. It's just that these are the factors that generally are seen to be more likely to coincide with injury, because you can be healthy, everything feeling good, high energy, perfect, and something could just go wrong that day. And that happens too. So now we've talked about kind of a little bit what can create the environment for an injury to be more likely to happen. How do you mitigate a little bit of that? What if you get hurt? What do you do? Well, first, I'm not a injury rehab specialist, but you're going to, want to see what the extent of the injury is. How bad is it? If you need, see, a doctor, get an X-ray, MRI, etc., physical therapist, work on use a good support team to figure out, just how bad the injury is. If it's something that seems bad, like a muscle tear or something that's like debilitating, like back pain, you can't bend over. But let's say you get a little tweak, something really minor. You're like, oh, I tweaked my shoulder a little bit, pressing's a little uncomfortable. It's not a 10 out of 10 pain, but maybe it's like a 5-6. I really shouldn't be pressing. I don't know. You heard it on bench press. Bench press feels a little iffy, but so what do you do in that case? Well, if your goal is building muscle, you got some options. You can try to find other movements that still train the muscle you're trying to train without maybe further aggravating whatever the tissue is that's a little bit tweaked. So let's say it's the bench press and you tweak your shoulder. Maybe overhead press still feels good. All right, well, okay, overhead press is good. So I can still train my shoulders. I'm not going to train them through the bench press, but I can train them directly through an overhead press without any pain. So you can kind of shift your movements around a little bit, find something that still works the target musculature that doesn't further cause pain. Maybe it's the tweak on the bench press was due to your grip width. Maybe you put a dumbbell because it's more free range. You don't find much discomfort. Okay, so maybe you do some dumbbell presses instead for your pec work instead of the bench press for a little bit to give some time for that tissue to heal before you bench press again. So that's what you can do. Like that's what I personally do and advise a lot of people do if their goal is to build muscle, especially if they get like a little tweak. Just find something to try to work around it best you can. You can play around with different rep ranges too. Maybe again, you tweaked your shoulder on the bench press. All pressing movements you try, flies, everything for your pecs generally don't feel that great, especially if they're loaded, like say 5 to 10 reps or 8 to 12 or something like that. But maybe you can do light push-ups, 20 to 30 reps, relatively close to failure without any pain. Well, then maybe do that. It's okay. It's not very heavy. Maybe that was your goal, is to lift heavy, but you can still build some muscle, train, within the 5 to 30 rep range and some movement close to failure to give that stimulus for muscle growth. You can find something like that. There's also blood flow restriction training I've had a lot of success with. So for those that aren't aware, basically you're preventing blood from leaving a target area. So let's say I hurt my elbow. This is a good, easy one to do. And any type of tricep movement I'm trying to do to build my triceps is causing some discomfort, all push downs, extensions, etc. Anything that's very tricep specific, it's just like, man, I just can't really load it. Even close to 30 reps still causes enough discomfort that I can't, with a load that would be appropriate to do like a 30 rep max, I get to like 15 reps and man, the pain is just really building up. So I can't even get close to failure with 30 reps with a light load. and causes that the maximum stimulus for muscle growth. Well, what would blood flow restriction be? It'd be putting a band around the upper arm, preventing some of the blood from leaving. So that does a few things. How is a 30 rep set able to stimulate muscle growth appropriately, being similar to, say, a 5 rep max? So now we got to give a little background. So the main driver of muscle growth is tension. That's the loading. So you need a certain amount of loading on the muscle fibers for them to get the sense that they need to adapt and get bigger as a response. And any load that allows you to lift near failure between 5 and 30 reps is appropriate in this area of creating enough tension. So now the loads closer to 5 reps, they provide enough tension simply through being heavy enough. But the loads closer to 30 reps, they provide enough tension because as you're doing the reps, you're accumulating what are called metabolites, which are causing the muscles to fatigue. And eventually, with enough fatigue, the muscles get tired enough that load, even though it's lighter, becomes heavy enough to the muscle that it's still heavy enough to signal that same thing near failure. So that's how the 30 rep set is working. Blood flow restriction training basically makes that fatigue loading component even more exaggerated because the blood is pooling as you're doing, your push downs. That's causing more and more metabolites to build because they're not flushing out because the blood and everything can't leave, which is causing the muscle to really fatigue in this state. And thus, you might even be able to use an even lighter load, or you don't have to do as many reps. So let's say I was going to do a load that I could do 30 reps, but around 15 is when I get I can't really do much more. The blood flow restriction might allow 15 to be my fatigue point, where now I can only do 15 reps total, but it's allowed me to get near failure with that same load. And there is research to show that blood flow restriction training, when done again in that like 5 to 30 rep range near failure, can allow someone to use lighter loads and stimulate similar amounts of muscle growth. Not similar amounts of strength, because strength is a load specific training adaptation, but it can still stimulate growth. And so this can allow you to work with even lighter loads while still being able to work within that range to grow. And part of that is the metabolites might enhance the response from tension to some degree to cause a similar amount of muscle growth. So it's not like the metabolites don't seem to cause growth on their own, but they seem to enhance the signal from tension. I hope that makes sense for those that maybe haven't read so much of the data. And so the blood flow restriction training can allow you to use even lighter loads to kind of help get some of the load off whatever that injury area is, but still put it onto the target musculature. So an example would be like using that type of idea, like a wrap around the arm, causing the blood to pool, and then allowing you to do a lot of movement with the triceps, getting near failure in that 5 to 30 rep range with an even lighter load, still getting a similar muscle growth response, but not further damaging the elbow in that example. So, if your goal is to build muscle, just find ways to work around it in the short term. It might open you up to some new stimuli that you might respond really well to. Just because blood, 5 to 30 reps can stimulate muscle growth similarly on a set to set basis. And, blood flow restriction training can do that too. Not everybody's going to respond to all of that the same. You might respond better to 5 to 10 reps for most of the time than 20 to 30. Or vice versa. You might have always been lifting heavy, and then you get an injury and it forces you to do 20 to 30 reps, and you find, wow, my response is even better to these higher rep ranges, because there is some individuality here. So don't always view an injury or a tweak as a major setback. Yeah, it maybe sets back your current plan, maybe disrupts that pattern, but it's also an opportunity. You can still, if you can, try to find a way to work around it, still get the same stimuli to some degree. And you might even find that trying out those things open you up to new modalities of training you enjoy more, or stimuli that you respond slightly better to. And then the last part, of course, is the mental. I've kind of approached for a tweak, kind of shifting your mindset from, oh, my plan is disrupted, my plan is interrupted, I can't do what I want to do, to, hey, I can still get the desired adaptation, I can try new things, let's experiment, let's try to still work through it. Then there's the coming back. You tweak your shoulder on the bench press. Some people will be kind of hesitant to bench press again because they don't want to tweak their shoulder again. Yeah, they found other movements, other patterns, they've worked around it, but then how do you return to that? Well, if it's a small tweak, generally, you don't have to worry. Most people will come back pretty easily, but just warm up slow, stay further away from failure, Just really pay attention to the tissue. Maybe you don't even train near failure. Maybe you do bench press as a warm up for your pressing workout, an example. So maybe you're bench pressing 200 pounds for 10 reps as your top set to build muscle, and you tweaked it. Well, maybe the first week you return back to bench press once everything feels good and healthy is maybe you just do 10 reps at 100 pounds. That's just a warm up. You just do that as a warm up, test the tissue, load it in that pattern, and then move on to whatever doesn't cause pain. Just move on to the whatever else you were doing. So that can be, a really good option. And then the next week, maybe you do 120, then 140, then 160, 180. And then now you've built the mental confidence through weeks of exposure and not having experienced that same pain response. Now you're kind of back up to where you were. Now you're doing hard sets of bench press again to build muscle. And you've kind of like worked through that transition. If it's a more serious injury, that one that requires maybe surgery or a lot of rehab time, downtime, something you get to go see doctors and therapists about. I've been there. It is a tough road to come back from, especially if you're a performance driven, like a power lifter. But I use the same idea, listen to your support team, find a good support team that's familiar with athletes, tell them your goals, be clear in your communication. And then, I always took the approach of load slowly. So of course, when I was majorly hurt, I'd find whatever patterns and movements I could do to work around and still get a stimulus. Because if you're performance driven, especially for strength, muscle growth is correlated heavily with strength. So even if you're building some muscle around those tissues, eventually you can probably translate that new built muscle into strength. So it's like a long-term focus. So I would shift my mindset around that. Two, I would slowly load the movement back in, kind of similar to what I said. If it was a bench press and I hurt my pec, maybe the first week's just the bar and then 65. And maybe it takes me 4 months to get back to really bench pressing. But, that builds confidence through not repeatedly injuring and tweaking myself, that I can kind of get back into that movement with the confidence that, hey, my body's going to hold up. Because at first you're not sure. It's like, man, I really hurt my pec. It was a slight tear in the bench press. I could still do some other movements. I was doing some push-ups, some occlusion, some blood flow restriction training. I was able to do some different things. I was able to work around it for a while. It's kind of healed. I've got the green light from my therapist and my support team to start lifting again. But man, I'm just really nervous. Just, start doing the bar for some reps and then, maybe the next week you do a little bit more low and just take the long game and slowly work. Because as you expose that tissue through that specific pattern that hurt it, and you aren't really getting that pain response, you're not really refilling that injury, it starts to alleviate that anxiety of a re-injury over time just through exposure, because you're rebuilding confidence in the movement. Because you're like, man, I heard it 4 months ago, and then I got the green light 2 months ago, and now it's been 2 months, and I was bench pressing 365, and that's what hurt it. But man, I'm back up to 275, and I haven't had any pain over these last 2 months. You start to build that confidence just through that time and exposure. And that's the best mental advice I can give in that case, because eventually, especially for performance driven people, with enough time and exposure and just kind of showing that the tissue can handle the movement and everything's ready again, it quiets that voice. At least it did for me, primarily. Not trying to get into a long injury rap sheet. I've already mentioned I have 2 separate AC joints. I've had grade 1 strains in both pecs multiple times. I've had partial tears in both adductors. I've torn my right lat and teres major to the point that there's tissue gone, and it wasn't able to be repaired through surgery. It's just gone. And I've come back from all those injuries, lifted more weight and all the specific movements over time. Some of them took longer than others, like the lat took over a year. But same process, just finding what you can do, what you can't do, focusing on what you can do, slowly integrate what you can't do, and then slowly load the things that you couldn't do before over time, rebuilding confidence. And listening to the support team. So, those are some questions I had gotten from people. I want to take some time to go over them, just because sometimes it can be hard to answer in a text or a DM, or, sometimes talking in person is great, but it'd be beneficial for other people to learn too. So I hope you guys enjoy this kind of solo Q&A style. If you like it, let me know. Give me some questions. I'm happy to talk about it. If you're not that big of a fan, you prefer more the guest interview style, let me know that too. I want to make sure I'm producing content that helps you guys. Primarily, this is something I want to do to give back to the community of fitness and lifting and powerlifting that's given me so much and helped me out over the years.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating and review wherever you are listening, if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast. If on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please let us know if you did or didn't like the episode, and all feedback is helpful. We will be releasing another episode 2 weeks from now. You can find us at Overcoming Resistance on YouTube and at Overcoming_Resistance on Instagram. Have a great day and take care.